Hello, my name is Jim, and we're going to be talking about first-time home buyers' essential toolkit today on
Kilimanjaro.
If you just bought a house, you're going to quickly realize that you need to have some tools. There's going to be things that break on the house that need to be fixed, and there's going to be things that you want to change on the house to make them more your style or just a little bit more up to date. You could, of course, hire somebody to do all those things, but you'll quickly realize that, particularly for small jobs, it gets very expensive very quickly if you need to call somebody every time you want something done. So you're going to need some basic tools to do that sort of stuff. In front of me, it's a basic toolkit, kind of the starter set of things you'll need to do a lot of jobs around the house. Not every single thing. Some of those things are going to require specialized tools that are only going to be used for certain jobs. But these are the tools that you'll be using just kind of every day when you're doing work on the house. So some of these tools are hand tools that you could very easily get used. As long as they're in good shape, they'll work just fine for probably another 50 years. Other tools are kind of power tools that you probably don't want to get used. They've either gotten a lot better in the recent years, or they just wear out fairly quickly and they're not worth getting used. So I'll talk about that as we go through. First up, let's talk about some safety gear here. Safety glasses are always good, very important to be wearing when you're working on stuff. You don't want things spraying in your eyes. It can happen very unexpectedly, so it's always good to have them on when you're doing any sort of work, but particularly if you're using any sort of power tools. Now, I particularly like this style. They're very inexpensive, so you can get a couple of them and then easily throw them out if they get scratched up, or you just have a bunch laying around so that they're right at hand, much more likely to use them if they're right nearby and very convenient to have. They don't have any big bulky stuff around them that blocks your field of view, and they're quite comfortable to wear. So you also might want to get some hearing protection. That's always a good idea if you're going to be working with power tools, and some good gloves. Now, be aware though that there are some jobs that you're doing that you may do where gloves are actually less safe. They can get caught in something and pull your hand into it. So keep in mind that gloves are not always the best option to be wearing. Of the other basic hand tools, these are a great option to get used at a garage sale or a flea market or what have you. The design of these basically hasn't changed in 100 years ago, and they don't tend to wear out too much. Now be aware that screwdrivers, the tips can wear out, particularly if they've been abused. So take a look at the tips of a screwdriver if you're going to be buying one used. And the same thing on pliers. Make sure that they open and close freely. These joints can get worn out, or they can just get bound up if they're haven't been well taken care of. So of these tools, let's start first with a tape measure. Got to have a tape measure. All sorts of things you're going to need it for, and there's a couple different styles. So the first main style is when you pull out the tape, it just stays out, and then you push the button to release it. The other style is kind of the opposite. You pull out the tape and then push down on the button to hold it in place. Both work perfectly fine. I have a couple of each. Don't really prefer one or the other. I'm sure there's some guys that swear by one, some guys swear by the other, but either one is fine. Now, if you're in the US, you're probably going to want one that's in inches and feet. They do make ones that are inches and feet and in meters, but that means that one side of them is not going to be useful, and they can be a lot more irritating to use. I prefer just to have one that's in inches and feet and then have another one that's in metric if I'm going to need that for something. You gotta have a hammer. I like having a good medium-sized hammer. You don't want some giant framing hammer for kind of day-to-day work. You don't want some little hammer. You're not going to be able to pull stuff apart or drive nails real easily with that. So I find this 16-ounce size is a good size, and you want to get one that has a claw that's nice and straight. Some other ones have the claw that's very curved. It's kind of a homeowner style, but it makes it easier to pull out nails, but with a straight claw, it's a lot more convenient for kind of prying boards apart, popping trim off, pulling a pallet apart, that sort of thing, and you can still use it very easily to pull nails out. Now for your screwdrivers, you want to get a set of Phillips and straight screwdrivers. You'll probably run into screws of each kind. And you need at least two, one of each, but it's nice to have a set of them for a couple different reasons. There are different size screws. There are different size Phillips and straight screws. Most Phillips screws are number 2, which is what this size is here, but there are bigger ones and smaller ones that you're likely to run into as well. So it's useful to have a set for them. You can kind of use the wrong size screwdriver, but you're likely to damage the screw or the screwdriver, so it's not a great deal. The other thing is if you have different size screwdrivers, you can run into situations where you can't find this screwdriver, so you can go use one that's kind of close and work it without being frustrated that you can't find your screwdriver. So having multiples of those can be pretty handy. So next up, this is kind of a channel lock style of pliers. Very handy for grabbing all sorts of things and turning it and what have you. The actual channel lock ones you have to pull apart and slide. I find this one here with the little button that moves up the jaw up and down would be a lot more convenient, so I do like this style better. They're a little bit more expensive, but I think they're worth it. There's different sizes of these. This is kind of the medium size. You don't really need one that's huge, although that can come in handy sometimes, but a good, nice medium one will cover you for most of the different jobs you're going to use. The next step, having a good pair of needle nose pliers is very handy. The needle nose lets you reach into places, grab small things that maybe your fingers can't pick up real well. They have a wire cutter on them to cut wires, which can be very handy. And then at the bottom here, there's another kind of extra grippy area for kind of turning various things or what have you. So very handy to have. Now the last thing here is an adjustable wrench. You're likely to run into nuts and bolts that you're going to need to tighten or loosen, and so you need some wrenches to do that. Ideally, you would have a whole set of wrenches because adjustable wrenches can cause problems where they might round off the head of the nut or the bolt or slip, and they can be kind of a pain to use. However, a whole set of adjustable wrenches, particularly if you're in the US, you're going to need a set of imperial and metric wrenches. That's a big ask for somebody who just got a house. So I find having an adjustable wrench is very handy, and you probably actually want two of them because you frequently will have to grab onto the head with one and the nut with another. Now there's a couple different styles. This is kind of the cheap style, and they work fine. Recently they've come out with a couple different newer styles. These ones will actually grab onto the nut or bolt, and so you can put a lot more pressure. You're a lot less likely to strip the head off them, and they also work for a very large range of sizes. There's this other little size here, this other little style here that can grab on very well, and these can actually ratchet around. Super handy, but both of these are quite a bit more expensive than your kind of standard adjustable wrench here. Lastly, one of the most important things is a knife. You gotta have a knife. This is your most basic kind of box cutter style knife. The blade just pops out just like that. This is kind of the old standard one. You have to unscrew it to get a new blade out of the handle. Not the most convenient, but these are dirt cheap. So you can have a couple different ones laying around if you can't find one. Some of the nicer ones have a bigger handle, have a quick change mechanism for the blade. Always handy to have as well. And then we also have a level. I wouldn't say this is crucial to have, but it can be very handy if you're going to hang pictures, stuff like that. Level appliances, make sure things aren't rolling around. And then I also find that having a couple clamps, these little spring clamps are very handy, or bar clamps, stuff like that. Also super useful to have around to be holding stuff in place while you're working on it, or to push stuff around to get it to be where you want it to be. Let's talk about a couple power tools now. Probably the first power tool that most people buy is a drill and maybe an impact driver. These frequently come in kits. The drill is for drilling holes, and an impact driver is for driving screws. You can use a drill to drive screws with, but the impact driver works a whole lot better. It puts out impacts that will rotate the screw in for you without really hurting your wrist, and it also puts out impacts that drive the bit into the screw and prevent it from camming out. So they're super useful. They work a lot better than a drill for driving screws. Now, what kind you get doesn't really matter. I would suggest, though, that you stick with one of the two biggest brands, either DeWalt or Milwaukee. Doesn't really matter between the two of them. They're both good tools. There's a lot of other brands out there that also make very good drills and drivers. However, they don't have as extensive a lineup of other tools. When you buy a drill and driver, they frequently come as a kit together with some of these little batteries, and the batteries will work in all the other cordless tools that manufacturer makes. And DeWalt and Milwaukee both have the most extensive kind of lineups of cordless tools. So if you buy a DeWalt or a Milwaukee, you'll be able to then go buy a saw or a grinder or something like that, and it's going to use the same batteries. If you were to get one of the other kind of brands, they may not have a tool that you want that uses the same batteries, and then you're going to end up having to get another set of cordless tools, and it's just not as convenient. So that being said, if you're really on a budget, you can get a kind of very inexpensive cordless drill and use it for driving screws. This one came from Walmart. It was about 20 bucks, super cheap, and it works quite well. It's quite a bit bulkier, it's quite a bit heavier, and battery doesn't last as long, but it works perfectly fine. So if you're on a tight budget, it's a good choice as well. I would suggest not getting a used one of these, though. The technology has improved pretty dramatically in recent years. The newer ones are smaller, have more power, are lighter, are more reliable and more durable, all that things. And also, if it's a used one, there's a good chance the battery is already, past its life and isn't going to work super well. These are both 18 volt or 20 volt, it's the same thing, tools, and those are a little bigger, a little more powerful. If you're kind of a smaller person, you may want to get a 12 volt set instead. So this is the Milwaukee 12 volt set. I would recommend sticking with Milwaukee if you're going to get a 12 volt one. They have by far the widest range of tools. The 12-volt drills work great. They have a ton of power, and they're a lot lighter and a lot smaller. They can get into tighter places, so very much recommend those, but there are some instances where it just doesn't have as much power that you might need as an 18-volt one. Now, to go with your drill and driver, you're going to need some bits to put in them. So first off, you probably want to get a set like this. It has kind of the most generic bits that you're going to use for driving screws. A bunch of Phillips bits, a couple straight bits, some square bits, and some Torx bits. It's going to be everything you're going to run into from day to day. Probably don't need one this big. I found that the bigger sets tend to just have lots of duplicates of like the Phillips bit, which can be useful because you're going to lose those over time or they do wear out. But you probably don't need as many as are in the bigger kits. What you really want is one that has a lot of variety. In fact, I very much recommend getting a little set like this. This one came off Amazon. It was like 20 bucks, and it has every bit that I can imagine in it. It's actually a little bit of a smaller bit size, but it has all sorts of security bits, security Torx, ones to open up a games console, an iPhone, all sorts of random stuff. It's super handy to have, and comes in useful all the time to have every bit for everything that I might need. On the drill side, you're going to want to have two sets of different types of drills. You want a set like this of all your kind of twist drills. Those are kind of your smaller sizes, very handy for any sort of drill under, like, say, a 1/2 inch, maybe 3/8 of an inch. You want to use a twist drill for that. And then you're going to want to be able to drill bigger holes as well. And you don't need a set this big. You really only need like a set of 3 drill bits, maybe just a 5/8, a 3/4, and one a little bit bigger than that. You can get a nice big set like this, but you probably don't need that many different drill bits. Next up, we have a circular saw here. Now, you can get a handsaw and make do just with that. Of course, you don't really want to be cutting a full sheet of plywood with a handsaw. You're going to be there all day, but they do work fine. Of course, people used them for hundreds of years before power tools came along. That was all they had. But I wouldn't recommend getting one of these. I would recommend just getting a circular saw instead. It's extremely versatile. There's all sorts of different cuts you can make with it, and they're not that expensive. So this is a corded version here. Plugs into the wall outlet. You can get one of these used. The corded versions haven't changed all that much over the years, so not a big deal. If you get a used one, though, I would recommend putting a new blade on it, a nice carbide tipped blade. It's going to cut just fine. It'll be a little bit heavier if it's an older one, but really not a big deal. You can also get a cordless one. If you do, you want to get one that uses the same batteries as your drill and driver, and then that works great. And those aren't even that much more than a corded one. To go with your circular saw, you want to get one of these. This is called a speed square. You put it up to the side of your circular saw, and then that lets you cut nice and straight or at an angle, depending on what you're trying to do. And it's got a ruler on it, a couple other useful things it can do. So very handy to have. Highly recommend getting one of these to go with your saw. Next up is you want a light. You could get a corded light, just basically a light bulb on a cord. Those work fine, but if the power ever goes out or you're working in a spot where you don't have electricity because you're working on the circuit and you've got to have the power turned off, having a cordless light is very handy. I like having a nice big light so you can see what you're doing. You could just use a flashlight, but I've had a flashlight sticking in my mouth and it's just a pain to deal with. Having a nice big light, very convenient. This one uses the same batteries as some of the big power tools. This is the Milwaukee 18-volt one. Very handy, so you can get one that uses the same batteries as your drill and driver. They all work together. But of course, there's other ones that work just fine and have their own batteries built in. I would suggest, though, that you get one that has lots of different mounting options. This one will clamp on a pole. The light flips out, spins around in all directions. Works great. And then lastly, and this is extremely important, you should get some sort of wet-dry shop vac. This is a very small one, just so it fits on the workbench here, but you can always get a bigger one. And the reason to have this is not just to clean up, although it's very important to clean up after yourself, is at some point when you have a house, you're going to have some pipe burst, you're going to get water in your basement, your water heater is going to blow, and you need to be able to clean up that water somehow. And a shop vac is kind of the best way to do that. Problem is, you don't want to be waiting for that to happen and then have to go run out and get one. That water is going to be sitting, or it may be late at night, all the shops are going to be closed. So you want to have a shop vac just in case that sort of thing happens. Now, there's a couple different sizes. Like I said, this is a very small one. You can get a much bigger one. The ones that roll out on the floor are great, but do be aware that you don't really want the biggest one possible. The bigger ones aren't necessarily any more power. Most of the shop vacs are limited by how much power you can draw out of a wall circuit, so they all have about the same amount of power. The bigger ones, though, can be more handy, but they take up a lot more room. And also, if you fill them all up with 10 gallons of water, they get very heavy and can be very difficult to move around. So just be aware of that. There you go. These are the basic tools that you want to have if you own a house. be able to maintain it, be able to do basic repairs on that house. Now there's other specialized tools you're going to want to have. You're going to be doing electrical work, or plumbing work, or painting, or things like that. Those are kind of specialized, and you may want to just decide you want to hire somebody to do those, so you're not going to need those tools. But these tools are something that every homeowner should have stashed away somewhere for when emergency happens, or just kind of basic maintenance. If you think one of these tools that I mentioned is a complete waste of time, let me know, or if there's something that I missed that you think is absolutely essential, leave a comment below. Otherwise, give this video a thumbs up, and thanks for watching.